Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 33. Remy, Clint, and Logan. By the end of the day, even Remy, who had been known to do some serious shopping from time to time, was reeling, because Stark's idea of shopping was a little scary. When he'd said everything, he'd meant everything, including colognes. Not that Remy had minded all that much. Unlike pretty much everyone else, he hadn't been reeling with sticker shock. Poor Steve! The man had nearly keeled over when he saw how much a plain shirt went for at Macy's. It had taken all of Pepper's not inconsiderable stubbornness to get Steve to re-agree to the wardrobe after that. No, Remy hadn't had that problem. If Tony wanted to blow his money on Remy, Remy was going to take full advantage of it. Remy liked looking good. After all, he just very rarely had the money to look his best. Remy put his new satisfied clothes away with a satisfied air. The suits and tux wouldn't be done for a while, not with so many needing to be done, but he had everything else with him already. Tony had reiterated his offer of a job in the security division. Remy had taken him up on it this time, relishing the chance to exercise his skill sets. Of course, Tony had made his first job trying to crack the tower. That was going to be fun. Remy was going to have to do all of his planning and investigating outside of the tower and not on Stark Industries equipment for starters, because he wasn't about to risk Jarvis peeking. But for now, shopping was done, and Remy was looking to stretch his legs and maybe do a little workout. Tony mentioned the gym was kitted out with gymnastics stuff, so he pulled on the flexible Kevlar armor he used in the field and headed there. To his surprise, he found it occupied, and the gymnastics equipment being used by none other than Natasha. Remy grinned as he watched her. She wasn't bad at all. It wasn't exactly an Olympic-style routine, but then again, neither was his. They both tended towards more practical applications of various moves from the looks of things. "You up for a bit of competition?" he called. Natasha glanced over at him. "Are you any good?" Remy didn't bother replying with words. He just took off, doing a quick run of back springs on the ground before launching himself up and over the lower uneven bar and whipping himself up and around the upper bar in a fair approximation of a backwards giant swing before he let go and landed in something that was anything but an Olympic-approved stance. A half-kneeling crouch with both hands away from his body, one holding a card, not lit up at the moment, the other his collapsed bowstaff. He grinned at Natasha. Natasha grinned right back at him. "This," she said, "is going to be fun." She wasn't wrong. It ended up being a good thing. The equipment, while it looked like Olympic-style equipment, had clearly been reinforced to hell and gone, because the two of them used it in ways it was never intended to be used. Each of them tried to outdo the other with more and more outrageous strings of moves. Remy was having the time of his life. Natasha wasn't as flexible as he was, but she came close, and she compensated for the difference in truly devious ways, which put her on about the same level as Remy was at. It wasn't until they'd worn each other out and were standing in the middle of the mats, both of them panting and giving the other to the pleased grins, that Remy realized they had an audience. Loki, Thor, Jane, and Darcy were all standing near the door. Jane and Darcy were both clapping, but all four looked at least slightly impressed. Darcy in particular was looking wide-eyed. "Dude, please tell me you're going to teach me some of that," she begged. Beside him, Natasha smiled. "Yes, I intend to," she said. "You got an apprentice, huh?" Remy said. Natasha nodded. "Of a sort. She'll never be me, but she knows that and doesn't want to be. But she's got what it takes to do pretty well for herself." Unreal. Clint said it before. He'll say it again. Unreal. Clint had done undercover work before. It was sort of necessary sometimes. Unfortunately, he was nowhere near as facile as Natasha. He could really only pass himself off as a small selection of people, and none of them any kind of rich or snobbish or well-bred. So he never really had call for more than one basic, fairly cheap suit. The clothes he just ended up with, courtesy of Stark, were about 5 levels above anything Clint had ever had in his life. And that wasn't even taking the new suit and tux into account. He smirked as he put away his new stuff. The tailor, a little old Italian fellow, had very nearly gone into spasms over Thor, and had then spent the better part of 10 minutes scolding Clint for his tendency to slouch. He'd even bitched out Bruce for the same thing, much to Clint's private amusement. Bruce hadn't looked like he quite knew what to do with someone who wasn't afraid to get in his face, and despite the fact that Angelo had to know exactly who Bruce was and what happened when Bruce got mad. He finished putting things away and headed out. He ran into Nat, who said something about the gym before she headed off. Clint wasn't in the mood for that, though. Instead, he headed for the entertainment level. He'd been there no more than about 5 minutes when Tony arrived. Here you are. You, my lab. Now, bow, quiver, arrows, go. Tony made shooing motions, tapping one foot while he waited for Clint. It took Clint a few moments to figure out what Tony was on about. Then, ow! And he hurried into the elevator because if Stark was going to make him new and better toys, far be it from Clint to stop him. They stopped off on Clint's floor long enough for him to grab his bow, quiver, and arrow shafts and pile back into the elevator. They were in Tony's lab a few moments later, and Tony made grabby hands at Clint's bow. Clint held it out, but hung onto it. I had better get this back in the condition I'm giving it to you, Stark, or I'm going to stick an arrow where the sun don't shine. Tony made a sound. Blaze like a loss. I would never do something as crude as tear your bow apart. Clint snorted and let go of the bow, then watched as Tony had Jarvis scan it, then handed it back. See? Not a scratch. Clint grinned and patted the bow. Thanks! He handed over the quiver and his arrow shafts when Tony made grabby hands at those necks with a lot less reluctance. Tony had them scanned very shortly thereafter. Okay, so which arrowheads do you use the most of? Tony wanted to know. The narrow, plain head ones and the explosive ones, Clint said immediately, followed by the barbed ones. Right. The weight on this quiver good? Clint nodded. It can actually go a couple pounds heavier if it has to. I've bulked up a bit since I first got it. Tony made a noise. Alright, that'll give you more arrows to work with, especially if I could strip out excess weight from elsewhere. He made a horrified noise when he enlarged the mechanism that allowed Clint to choose which arrowhead to use. Oh my god, this is horrifying. This is tragic. This is pathetic. God, I am ashamed to have this exist. Really, who built this for you, Minnie Mouse? He started stripping things out right and left, flicking them into the holographic garbage can with a look of disgusted dismay. Clint laughed. Shield R&D worked for a year to get that built, he said, and earned himself a horrified look from Tony. This is pitiful. I'll have something better by morning, Tony told him. Clint took that as his hint to escape while he could before he got kidnapped. He headed back up to the entertainment level. By then, there were several others there, 2 kids playing a game. They barely glanced around when they heard the elevator door. Clint made his way up the wall to the catwalk and settled in on one of the slightly wider platforms, leaning against the wall and watching the kids play their game idly. Logan decided to hunt Steve down after they all got back. Ever since Steve had told him that bit, Logan had been, well, not sure how to deal with the kid. Because the guy Steve remembered was pretty much dead and gone. Would be even if by some miracle Logan got all his memories back simply because Logan had been through some crap since Steve had known him, and that changed a man. Unfortunately, avoidance, as much as Logan might wish, wasn't going to be the answer, not with them in the same building, and not with Steve having at least a few answers, especially since Logan had been poking at his black hole memory more than usual, and for once it spat something out that wasn't related to him getting the adamantium. Logan didn't know if the flashes of images were wishful thinking or what, but he figured Steve might know since the flashes involved at least one glimpse of Captain America. Steve had headed for his floor after the shopping was done, so Logan dumped his crap on his bed. Jarvis asks Steve if he's up for some company. He says he would be pleased to have your company, Logan, Jarvis said after a moment. Logan nodded and patted his pockets to make sure he had cigar and lighter before he headed for the elevator. When he stepped out, he walked into Steve's main living area. There were a couple pencil drawings tacked to the wall in one corner, and evidence of recent drawing on one of the drawing desks beneath where the drawings had been put up. Logan cocked his head a little because one of the drawings looked like Stark, except not quite. The hair was a little different and more tame, the face a bit narrower and younger. Given Steve had drawn it, Logan figured that it must be the current Stark's old man. The portrait next to that was of a gal Logan didn't recognize. He could hear Steve moving around in the bedroom, evidently putting his stuff away. "I'll be out in a minute, James," Steve said. Said, as in made no effort at all to raise his voice like most people do when they're a room or two away from someone they're talking to. Logan had long ago become inured to dealing with what were to him rather extreme levels of sensory information. Scents and sounds were the worst. There was a reason Logan almost always had a cigar lit and in his mouth when he wasn't actively tracking or out kicking someone's butt. The scent of the smoke curling under his nose blocked out just about everything else. Sound, though, was a pain in the butt most of the time. It was a pretty much non-stop assault. Worse, most people completely forgot his senses were that good. He didn't really blame them because it wasn't like every other person out there had senses like his. Rogue, of course, knew and remembered. She'd changed her preferred perfume to a light, naturally scented one and never, ever yelled when she knew he was close by. But she was one of the few. Steve had been told about Logan's senses once, to Logan's knowledge, and he was keeping his voice to normal levels. "Take your time," he called in return. Steve came out a minute later. "Want something to drink?" "Got any beer?" Logan asked. Steve shook his head. "I can't get drunk, so I don't bother," he admitted. Logan snorted. "Might consider drinking it for the flavor," he pointed out. "I'm sure Stark can point you to the best brands for that. I'll just have some water then." Steve juggled at him. "Yeah, Tony would have the best brands for that. Just never thought of drinking for the taste, you know?" He headed into the kitchen and came back out a minute later with a big tumbler of water. "So I'm guessing you have questions?" "A few, but mostly curious because I've been poking around trying to remember anything," Logan admitted. "And like hell if I know if it's wishful thinking." "And you're hoping I'll know what you're on about?" Steve said. "Yeah, there's one for sure you're in. Something to do with the biggest tank I've ever seen. Or not, as the case may be." Steve sat forward. "Was it about 2 stories tall or so?" Logan nodded. "Yeah, that's real," Steve said. "Hydro tank. The commandos ran into a lot of them, including while you were working with us." Logan sat back, feeling odd in a way he couldn't explain. So it was real. He had at least one partial memory that had been confirmed. Part of him wanted to celebrate because it was about time. The rest of him was just getting greedy and wanting more.